Hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and today my guest is Simon Small. Hi. Hello. Simon.
Thank you for asking me.
Simon's written a couple of books. There's From the Bottom of the Pond, The Forgotten Art of Experiencing God in the Depths of the Present Moment. And we're going to build a lot of the interview around this book. And he's also written a novel which is partly biographical, which is called Star Pilgrim, a story of the deepest mysteries of existence. And I'm sure we'll touch on this as well. So Simon, you stand out from many of our guests who cover the whole non-dual angle because you actually are a priest in the Church of England.
I am indeed, yes.
And it's the contemplative tradition that you really like in the Church of England,
yes.
you were attracted to.
Yeah.
So let's just look briefly at how you got there in terms of your journey, because you told me earlier that actually as a child you did go to Sunday school, but you didn't really connect with what was being taught there.
No, I think like a lot of people of my generation, I was brought up going to church. My parents went, and so I went along, and I was taken to Sunday school, but it never really connected with me at all. And when I got to the age of about 13, and I was told the bishop needed to come and lay his hands on me to confirm me, I actually refused to be confirmed. I told my dad, no, I'm not going through with it. And after that, I had nothing to do with religion or spirituality for about 20 years.
So when you said you didn't want to go through with it, was that an instinctive feeling inside you, or was that just knowing it was wrong for you?
It was just knowing it would have been a lie, because I was going through high school, I was learning all about science, I was being taught to think rationally and skeptically. And then on a Sunday, I was going to this place which was giving me all these unbelievable stories and telling me I had to believe them. And then the moment came when I kind of had to own those stories for myself, and I couldn't do it. And so I said, no, I won't go any further with this. And fortunately, I had a very understanding dad who went along with it.
Because you had some quite deep questions, didn't you, for a teenager that were inside you? Yeah,
it only occurred to me a few years ago that whilst I was on this kind of journey as a child in the church and eventually leaving the church, at the same time, almost separately, I had this huge interest in the greatest questions, like what is this moment and what is time, and questions like, if I'm not here paying attention, is there anything? And these are the questions of a child. But I never connected those questions with what was going on in church. There was just a complete gulf between them. So that there was a natural interest in the great mystery of being, but no connection with what was going on in church.
And what did you do with those questions at the time?
I just pondered them, I thought about them, but the place I really found where I could go into them was in science fiction. And I was an avid reader of science fiction. Because in science fiction, the greatest questions are explored. They're dissolved into a story, but they're there. And I found in reading people like Arthur C. Clarke and Philip Dick and all those people that I could begin to connect with these other questions that were kind of there, moving around in my depths.
And then you basically did quite well professionally in life, and you got married, and everything in your life was hunky-dory?
It was. I did all the usual things, went off and chased girls, and eventually I caught one, to my great surprise, and got married. I went up the career ladder and had 2 amazing children, and I think probably quite naturally that absorbed all my attention. I gave everything to that. But what happened for me, and I think this is something that happens now for a lot of people in our society, is that I got to a certain age, maybe in my 30s, when I'd reached quite a senior level and all this kind of thing, when everything was perfect, but I found inside there was this big black hole. It was like I was living just by going through the motions. And that black hole of meaning, what is all this about, just got bigger and bigger. And eventually the time came when I really had to pay attention to that.
So when you say black hole, can you describe that more?
Yeah. It's like, the simplest way to describe it is, it's like when you actually can't think of a good reason to get out of bed in the morning. Why should I get out of this bed, get in this car, drive 10 miles to this incredibly stressful job, come home again, go to bed, and then do the thing the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And just this feeling began to develop that this isn't actually what life is all about. That there's a deeper reality somewhere, a meaning that's actually part of that reality, and that I'm just not making up with my mind. And that's really how I would describe that black hole. But the big thing that came with that black hole was guilt, because I had everything. You know, the lovely house, amazing wife, who I'm still married to, 2 wonderful children, all the rest of it. And yet I couldn't find satisfaction and happiness. And that brought with it great guilt. And that was something I had to look at very carefully as well. The two seemed to go together.
So why did you feel guilty?
Because I had everything that the world told me I needed to make me happy, and I wasn't. And so maybe it was part of my church upbringing that there was a sense of not being grateful. I ought to be grateful for this. I shouldn't be moaning and complaining about this. Pull yourself together. Come on, have a look at what you've got. It's all this kind of thing. But really, it doesn't work, because what's beginning to happen is something much deeper is being revealed. And that's really where I had to begin to put my attention.
So in a way, some of these childhood questions were re-emerging, weren't they?
Yes, very much. They re-emerged occasionally during the 20-odd years when I wasn't involved in religion or spirituality. I can remember once walking into an office where I worked, my head full of the town and country planning acts. Probably can't think of a more boring existence than that, but my head, this is what I did. And I remember walking through the door of my office, standing there, and there were all my colleagues busy, and I was full of this letter I'd received. And suddenly it was like something in my mind gave way, and I was just watching what was happening. And there were these thoughts, well, this is meaningless. There's all these people here having all these intense conversations on the telephone and passing these pieces of paper around. It's like we're just performing a script. We're just playing roles. We've invented all of this. It's not real. And all that happened in about a second when I stood in the doorway of the office. And then I remember thinking, Simon, you can't think like this. You know, there's nothing left if you think like that.
This is devastating, this kind of thing.
It is.
Isn't it?
And all they think it's all real, so it must be. And I can remember deliberately clicking back in to the Town and Country Planning Act 1948 and all its implications, and just plunging back in. But there were moments like that that I actually found quite frightening. Now I realise there was something special.
So you could say in a way you got to a mild depression, and yet you chose to be intelligent about it and look for a positive way forward, because you started to search, didn't you?
My wife was intelligent about it, as wives tend to be.
Okay.
And one night it got so bad I was just sitting in a room with the light turned off. And my wife came in and asked the question you don't want them to ask, like, why are you sitting in the room with the light turned off? And then she turned the light on. She said, what's going on? And for the first time I actually told her, because I'd hidden it from her, or tried to. And she listened to me, and I thought she might be cross or something, or not understand what was going on. And all she said was, I've got a book you should read. And it really took me aback. I hadn't expected that. And she said it's a book which was written by somebody who's dead. And I said, well, Shakespeare's dead, and I read his stuff. And she said, no, allegedly it was written by somebody after they were dead. And that kind of stopped me in my tracks a bit. And it was a book from the Spiritualist tradition by a man called F.W. Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. And he'd said that if there is life after death, after he died, he'd come back and give messages, and this book was these messages he was meant to give. Now, whatever one makes of those claims or not, what the book did for me was actually address what I was feeling. For the first time, I heard it articulated what I was experiencing. That this lack of meaning I was finding was because I needed to find spiritual meaning, something much deeper than a meaning that human beings make up. And it actually spoke about how I was feeling. And it's like anything, when suddenly you find what you feel being articulated, it's like a great release. And also you realise you're not alone. And that book was the start, really, of a great spiritual search. And it all started with my wife, understanding what was going on.
So what form did that search take?
Well, it kind of stuttered a bit to start with. But eventually, I started off in spiritualism, because I knew somebody also who'd been healed by a spiritualist healer, and I knew the medical history, I knew everything, all the background, and it kind of blew my mind apart finally. And so I actually went along to a spiritualist centre, and I was only involved for about a year or so. A lot of what went on was well-meaning, but not really strong evidence of anything. But I had odd experiences that blew my socks off and made me realise that reality was far deeper and more subtle than I'd ever guessed. It didn't mean I knew what it was or what was going on, but I just realised that my very hard kind of materialistic view just wasn't adequate anymore.
So for people that don't know, Simon, what happens at a spiritual church?
The Spiritualist Movement, which started back in the 1870s, really is based around mediums who claim to be receiving messages from discarnate entities. They may be people who have died and passed on,
okay,
or they may be kind of higher beings who are coming through and bringing wisdom. And that's really what lies at the heart of spiritualism. But two things spiritualism really taught me was, one, it introduced me to meditation, the practice of stilling the mind, in various ways you can do that. And I'd never come across that in my life. I've been brought up in the church, but nothing like that had ever been introduced to me. And I took to that as a duck to water. I can still remember the first time I meditated. And the other thing that spiritualism suggested to me was that it is possible for each of us as individuals to have a direct relationship with God. I'd always thought it was about singing hymns and going to church. But in spiritualism, they suggested to me that whatever we mean by this word God, the source of all there is, that from which this moment is coming, we can have a direct relationship. And again, that was one of these powerful ideas that I took with me. But then I moved on from spiritualism.
But at that point, what did a direct relationship with God mean to you?
It meant that when I became very still in my mind, I began to sense I wasn't alone. That this didn't always happen, but from time to time there was a sense that there was something there reaching back to me that was awesome. You have to use words like this, an awesome presence. And that as I began to express myself to that presence, it seemed to respond. Not necessarily some great booming voice, but thoughts would come, intuitions would come. Perhaps a few days later I'd find somebody out of the blue answering the question which I'd posed. And I began to realise that at the heart of this moment there is a presence with which it is possible to begin to build a relationship. And different spiritual traditions have different words for that presence, but in my tradition we use the word God.
And I think you were also at the same time, a little bit later, you were exploring A Course in Miracles.
Yes, after spiritualism really, I came across A Course in Miracles. And for those who don't know, A Course in Miracles is a channeled teaching, channeled by a lady called Helen Schuckman, who found this voice speaking in her mind. which was very worrying to her because she was a clinical psychologist and she thought she was going bonkers. But basically, with another psychologist, she went through the process of writing down what she was hearing. And out of that, over a period of years, there came a thick book of spiritual teachings called A Course in Miracles. And the claim is that the voice she heard was that of Jesus. And I spent some years working with that, and it helped me enormously. One way of understanding it is the Christian path as an inner path rather than an outer path. It's almost a Christian form of Buddhism. Very loosely, one can understand it in that way.
So what do you mean by inner path and outer path?
Okay. If you were to, for example, get involved in your local parish church, you would find that as an expression of their spirituality, they will be doing wonderful good works in the community around them. They will be building a community based in that church building. They will be seeking to relate to God through acts of ritual out here, through the singing of hymns out here, through praying out here. But what you won't find probably in most parish churches is another spiritual path, and that is the path within which one begins to go inward and begins to pay attention to what it is to be this conscious being. And by stilling thought and by paying attention to the mind, one begins to find that there is as much depth and mystery in here as there ever is out here. And one begins to understand why one reacts to the world in the way one does. Why does that person push my buttons? I don't want them to push my buttons, but they keep pushing my buttons. But as one begins to pay attention to the flow of thought and the energy that's behind certain thoughts, you begin to see why that person is pushing your buttons. And because you've seen it, it stops happening. There's this path of knowing oneself, know thyself. But there's more than that, because one begins to experience a taste that one is not separate to everything else. That this hard sense of being separate and cut off from all of this and just relating to it is actually just a perception. And that whatever I am is flowing out of the source of everything, just as that table is, and this room and the trees outside. And as one goes within, one begins to get tastes of that, but also of this awesome presence that lies behind everything, and that's the inner path. Some people are called to one, some to the other, but the inner path is very much what burns in my heart.
It sounds as though it starts with a desire to understand yourself,
Yes.
to know yourself,
Yes.
as you say, to understand why you react to something, and through that something starts to broaden in terms of horizons and how you see life and yourself.
Yes. There was a great Indian spiritual teacher called Ramana Maharshi who said that the whole of the spiritual path is just based around one question: who am I? And I think he said if you pursue that question, not necessarily intellectually but contemplatively, it will take you to whatever this word God refers to. And it's like there's a little doorway that you kind of squeeze through, and eventually you find there's this limitless universe behind. But it just starts with asking these little questions about who am I and why am I reacting like this.
So it takes you to a place you can't imagine, in fact.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Just to keep your story in sequence before we
Yeah.
move on, you also were attracted to Buddhism, weren't you?
Yes, I spent quite a lot of time with Theravada Buddhism, which is based around the Four Noble Truths. And when I found Theravada Buddhism, I actually thought I'd found my spiritual path. I'd been on this great exploration for some years by then, and you have this feeling that, well, at some time you're going to have to choose something and commit to it. And when I found Theravada Buddhism, that was the feeling I had. I loved its rationality, and I love its power to penetrate very, very deeply into the human condition, and its power to generate a kind of a quality of consciousness where one was very, very present. And it got to the point where one day I was actually at a monastery in the shrine room thinking, Simon, it's time to commit now. You need to go out there and say to the abbot or the prior, I want to take the lay vows now. But I couldn't do it. And I couldn't understand why I couldn't do it, because the monks were so amazing and Buddhism so appealed to me. But as I stood in that shrine room, I just tried to still my mind and then just hold the question, why can't I do this? And it was one of those moments where a thought comes out of nowhere, and when those thoughts happen, they're incredibly powerful, because most of our thoughts come from our other thoughts, but this thought came out of nowhere, and it said, because you're a Christian, which absolutely bowled me over. I mean, it's the most uncool thing I could imagine, and I never thought I would go back to that in a million years. But it was such a powerful moment. I knew it was true. But it wasn't a rejection of Buddhism. I still have enormous respect for Buddhism. It's a wonderful, wonderful spiritual teaching. It was more a turning towards where my heart really was. And more than where my heart was, I think we like to think we're in control, but we're not. And beneath this kind of outer surface of existence, there are deep currents that move, deep flows. And really, I think I was just recognizing the current I was in, and I had to start fighting that current. And so I went from that monastery and started to reconnect with the Jesus tradition very carefully because of my experiences as a child.
So how was that for you, that turn in your life direction?
It was a complete shock. And I didn't quite know how to go about it. So I decided I'm going to forget all the Christianity stuff and I'm just going to focus on Jesus. Because there was an extraordinary life there, an extraordinary being that existed long before, hundreds of years before the church came along and started imposing all these meanings on that life and that being. So I started trying to connect with anything that would take me back to the, if you like, the original Jesus. And the big thing that did this for me was something called the Gospel of Thomas, which is not a gospel you'll find in the conventional Bible, but it's a collection of sayings by Jesus, but sayings very, very much about the inner path. Many of them are almost Zen-like. And he says to you things like, the kingdom of heaven is within you. And just see what is before your face and all will be revealed. These are contemplative teachings. Many of them could have come from a great Buddhist teacher. And the Gospel of Thomas helped very much to reconnect me with Jesus. But at that point, I never had any idea I'd actually reconnect with the church. And that was a little further down the road. But one thing that is interesting is this turning back to my roots. Because I find this with a lot of people who I meet, that they've gone off and explored all kinds of things, particularly the great Eastern traditions. But eventually they just feel they need to return to their cultural spiritual roots, and they try and find a way back to this mysterious Jesus figure. You can go into all the alternative bookshops in Glastonbury where I live, and amidst all the dowsing and the goddess and goodness knows what else, it's full of books on Jesus. There is just a fascination, a pull to this figure.
I think around the same time you were starting to slow your life down as well, weren't you? Reorganise your life a bit.
Yes, my wife has been part of this journey with me. I think quite naturally, as one begins to try and pay attention to what's going on in here, the mystery of this moment becomes apparent. That we have no idea what this moment is. We spend most of our life thinking we know what's going on. But if you really pay attention to this, I mean, why are there two bags of skin and bones which have come up out of the ground and which were once stardust sitting here speaking to one another? And I think what happens is, as one naturally begins to pay attention to this deeper reality, you just begin to slow down because you're finding such a richness in everything. You no longer want to have your diary full. you no longer want to drive on the fast lane of the motorway or whatever it is. You just begin to slow down with everything, because there's a richness here, well, that was certainly I found I'd been missing for so many years, because I was all wrapped up here in my stories and my ambitions, and I was like a multi-millionaire who didn't realise the riches they'd got.
We'll come on to that and explore that a bit more later. Just to finish off the story, as such, you were then ordinated into the Church of England as a priest.
Yes, I never thought I'd have anything to do with the church at all, until one day a friend of mine, who was into A Course in Miracles, said, the local church is running a day on the church and the New Age. Should we go along and shock them? And we were young and wild then, and yeah, come on, let's go. They'll be totally shocked, won't they? And so we went, thinking we'd be condemned and told we were all wrong and all the rest of it. But actually we were given an amazing welcome. And there were all these priests there, wearing their dog collars, who just wanted to hear what we had to say. And I spent a whole day in conversation and being really listened to. And it changed me. And when I came home, I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what it was. And within a short time, I got re-involved with the church. And shortly after that, they kind of said, you need to be ordained. And so I went off to theological college for 2 years and eventually got ordained and ended up as a priest.
How was that, being a priest?
I found it very difficult, because I came from such a different spiritual culture. I love the Church of England. It's been incredibly kind to me, and I'll never say a bad word about it. But if you go into most parish churches, there's enormous focus on activity and busyness and doing things out here. Whereas I came from a spiritual culture of meditation and contemplation and being very still. And the two never really met. It was always difficult. Then again, I never had any doubt that I was called by God to be a priest. And everybody around me felt that as well. But there didn't seem to be an obvious match. And so we all just kind of went with it, seeing where it would go. But I found the church amazingly kind, and eventually they arranged a part-time job for me as a chaplain to a bishop, so that I could still have a foot within the church, but also in the rest of my time explore and teach contemplation, this path that so fascinates me. So the church has always been incredibly kind to me. But eventually I became a full-time teacher of contemplation, writing about it, running retreats, and that's what I do now.
So let's talk more in depth about contemplation. What does contemplation mean to you?
Okay. Contemplation is an ancient Christian word for a universal experience. Contemplation describes what happens when we have those moments, like I did walking into the office, when suddenly our very small world that we're living out in our head almost seems to dissolve, and suddenly there's this vast mystery there in the moment. And we all have experiences like this. Many of us have them out in nature. We'll be walking along and there'll be a moment when the sunlight coming through the branches and hitting the leaves just stops us in our tracks. And there's a sense of time almost stopping as well. And there's almost a sense of resonance in the moment, so we're no longer separate to that sunlight and those leaves. There's something vibrating there which is vibrating in us as well. And we've all had these moments. Some people have had them around death. The death of a loved one blows our minds apart. And the sheer mystery of being here hits us. Sometimes it's the sound of the rain on the roof, or it might be music, or it might be the eyes of a baby looking at you. We've all had these moments. But what the Christian tradition of contemplation says, and it's the same as the Eastern traditions say, is that those moments are really special. because most people have them and then go back into their normal world. But these contemplative traditions say, what happens if we try to nurture those moments, to expand them, to experience them more often, and then relate to life from that kind of consciousness? And that's when these great contemplative traditions start, which say that, well, actually what's happened there is you've just become very present in the moment with all of your consciousness, which is normally scattered through the past and the future and all your desires. But in that moment, spontaneously, it's come together. And that's why you've had that experience. So what happens if we actually begin to practice bringing our attention into this moment? And there you get all the great practices of meditation and mindfulness. But that's all they're trying to do. Bring and focus our attention into this moment and begin to grow contemplative consciousness and live from that place. And that's one way of understanding what contemplation is.
It also takes a degree of courage to follow it too, I think, doesn't it? Because it means that you're, like what happened with you,
Yes.
you're also saying, well, maybe everything I've worked for in life so far isn't the real deal, so as to speak.
Yes.
And it's like, can be a new beginning, a new set of values.
It can. At first, it's a wonderful experience because you've never quite tasted anything like it. It's like the finest wine you've ever tasted, and you become aware you know your mind has been such a mess before, and now suddenly life has gone to colour from black and white. But then very quickly one begins to realise that if you're going to pursue this, you're not going to live in the same way anymore in the world. Things that you used to value, you won't value anymore. And you'll begin to value things that you'd never dreamed of before. And so, for example, it took me out of gainful employment. I used to be a very senior manager in large organisations. Unbelievable looking at me now, but I was. But after a while I couldn't do that anymore. And I just moved out into other things, all of which in some way helped to nurture this wish to be a contemplative. But yes, eventually it will begin to change your life dramatically.
Mm. I know from my own experience that life does guide you,
Yeah.
but it's not always easy to see exactly where it's taking you. As I said earlier, it's not always easy to have the courage to say, well, I need to let go of this and that person, that job, whatever, and start afresh, especially as one gets older.
Yes. It got to the point with my wife and I where even though it was difficult, we couldn't imagine doing anything else. Mm. Because not to pursue this would really be like a kind of death, really. And actually, I don't think we could have gone back into living how we used to live. One area which can be difficult is relationships, because you will have known people perhaps all your life, and you will have been a certain person. You start to explore the mystery of existence, the mystery of this moment, and you start to explore contemplation, and you become someone else. And what used to interest you doesn't anymore. Mm. And it can be very difficult for people who've known you for a long time. And that's something one has to deal with in as kind and as compassionate a way as possible.
One of the things you talk about in the from the bottom of the pond book is that contemplation is at the heart of all religions, not just the Christian religion.
Yes. That's my belief. Other people may have another view. But I think that all true spiritual pathways have begun at some point in this taste of God, this opening to the mystery of this moment, the reality of what we're talking about. What's then happened over the centuries, I think, is that as people tried to describe that living experience, others have then taken those words, they become detached from the experience and just become something you believe in. And if you believe in it, you're saved. If you don't believe in it, you're not saved. But I think all these spiritual pathways have begun with a taste of that universal human experience. So it is at the heart of everything. But I think also that if I just take my own tradition, the Christian tradition, we have all these doctrines which drive people balmy and force so many people away because we come at them with a normal mind. But if you go into a contemplative consciousness, deeply in this moment, aware of the awesome nature of just being, and then you come to these Christian doctrines, they light up in a whole new way. And you realize that those ideas that are contained in those doctrines originally came from this kind of consciousness. And so the contemplative way brings alive the Christian tradition in a way that I think would be so helpful to many people, but they don't even know it's there.
And do you see within the Christian church this side growing?
Very slowly. It was always there, maybe for the first 1,000 years, 1,200 years of the Christian tradition. But it started to get lost when the Western church had to start defending itself against the Reformation, and then defending itself against the intellectual Enlightenment. And contemplation's all kind of intangible. And when you want to defend yourself, you want firm ideas, strong arguments, and it kind of got lost. But now it's starting to re-emerge. It was held in the monasteries and in the great monastic communities. But now it's starting to re-emerge into mainstream Christian life, very slowly. But one thing that's happening is that there's a lot of people who have gone off and explored the great Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zen, but then find themselves being drawn back to the Christian tradition, but bringing this with them, and then finding it was there all along, but had been lost. So something's happening from the bottom upwards, while perhaps those in charge of these great churches aren't necessarily aware of what's happening. Churches do tend to change organically, so something is happening very slowly.
I'm going to ask you to read something from your book, which touched me. It's fairly near the beginning.
Yeah.
Just a few lines there. I've marked it. If you can just read that.
Okay, thank you. All right. I mean, I have to take my glasses off for this, I'm afraid. I've reached that age.
I think we can manage that.
Yes. This is just an extract from a short chapter which is describing an experience I had once, looking at the night sky and sensing that what was in me wasn't separate to that. One of these great moments, Zen moments, if you like. And I tried to put some of it into words. I stand at the bottom of the pond as the fulcrum of limitless space, within and without. A gateway to both, an icon that joins the two. But who am I, so small and insignificant, yet at the heart of existence? As I ponder this question, infinite space reveals itself once more. For as hard as I look, I cannot find myself. I can only find thoughts, memories, fears, beliefs, and concepts that constantly arise and cease. But whoever I am does not arise or cease. I am who I have always been. Different thoughts and a new body, but I am who I am. And as my mind stills, consciousness expands without limit. There is a deep sense that, indeed, it has no limit. It, too, is infinite, vibrantly alive space. As I stand at the bottom of the pond, I am the still centre of awesome space. But so is every other human being. And in its own way, so is every animal, plant, virus, bacteria, and living cell. And in some far distant galaxy, on another insignificant lump of rock, at the bottom of another pond, stands another still centre of space, staring upwards and inwards, filled and humbled by the mystery of existence.
Thank you.
Thank you. I should perhaps just explain that when I was talking about being at the bottom of a pond, part of that moment was when, as I looked up at the stars, I realised I was existing in this shallow smear of atmosphere, air. And it was just like I was at the bottom of this tiny little pond of air, gas, looking out at that. And that's where that phrase came from.
It seems that the more we look within to find ourselves, the less we find what we expect to find.
Yes. We're back to Ramana Maharshi's question, who am I? In the Christian tradition, there was a great Trappist monk called Thomas Merton who wrote about this.
Yeah, I'm aware of him, yeah.
And he wrote about it in a different way, saying the same thing. That the spiritual path, the Christian spiritual path, is about finding our true identity. Not who we think we are, that we're living out here, this very temporary personality. And he had a wonderful visual image. He said that when you find out who you truly are, it's like you go into yourself through your belly button and come out the back and turn yourself inside out. And you find an awesome being there, which words cannot do justice to. And that awesome being is what God is always seeing you as well. That was another of his teachings.
But do you see a separation between you and God?
I see no separation, but I see a difference. Simon Small is not God. My wife and children discovered that years ago. But God is being this. For a short time, the energy, the force, the creative power of God is being this body and this personality. But this body and personality is not God.
So it's like you're a manifestation of God.
Yes, yes.
An expression of God.
Yes. I am a creation, and what is created cannot be the creator, but it can still possess all the attributes of the creator and still be an outpouring, an emanation of the creator. This is where this gets difficult. This is where we're beginning to talk about something that our minds and our concepts and our words can't hold. So really, any words I say are just pointing towards something. They're just being suggestive. They can never be literal.
Because the view many people have of God, as
Yeah.
I understand it in the Christian church, is that God has judgment on them, and there's heaven and hell, and
Yeah.
it's about doing the right thing, and that
Yeah.
can vary between religions and people.
Yeah.
Do you feel there's a judgment from God?
The first thing I would do is not have an opinion on that, but first of all try to be as present as I can and have as deep a state of contemplative consciousness as I can to bring those ideas into. To be as connected as I can with God before I even try and consider those ideas. And the best intuitions I've had over the years is that God doesn't judge us in the sense of a judge in a wig with a gavel and sentencing us to this punishment and that punishment. There is something that takes place which is kind of a judgment, and that is, I think, that God, if you like, and again this is metaphor, holds a perfect mirror in front of us and says, this is who you are and this is what you've done. I've never judged you. You know, my forgiveness is complete. But for you to open to that, you have to honestly acknowledge what you are and what you've done. And then it just flows. But that's just kind of love trying to get us to see ourselves more fully. It's not judgment in the sense of heaven and hell. Hell for me is the more cut off I am from God, the word I use in my tradition, the more I experience hell. At the moment I'm feeling quite connected, but in a minute I might get on a train and it may be late, and I'll feel very disconnected from God, and that's a taste of hell. For me, these are states which we are tasting from moment to moment, depending on how present we are.
So hell is disconnection, being
Yes.
caught in the separation, and heaven is knowing or feeling or living who you truly are,
Yes.
the oneness you were talking about
This
earlier.
resonance with the source of this moment, that presence, that will, that intelligence from whom this is pouring. That is a taste of heaven. And in the Bible, I mean, I don't want to start quoting the Bible, but Jesus says things like, the kingdom of heaven is here now. I mean, what a teaching. But we're not seeing it for some reason. And all these teachings are there if you look for them. And that's my understanding of what we mean by terms like heaven and hell and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So God is really about being present.
And discovering something and being in relationship with that. That's what all this is about for me.
Talk more about this, being in relationship with that.
Well, I'll talk about it from within the Christian tradition, because I think that's what people might find helpful. In the Christian tradition, we have this word prayer, and often when you use that prayer, you can see people's eyes glaze over, you know, and they start making their excuses and want to leave. But really, what all that word prayer is referring to is an experience and an exploration of relationship. For me, prayer means relationship. And for me, in the depths of this moment, there is this awesome presence, which I want to ever more deepen my relationship with. But I think if I look at my human life, I can see that I relate to people in a number of ways. I talk to people. I tell them my problems. I tell them my woes. I tell them what excites me. And in the same way in prayer, that is part of prayer, that one actually speaks to God. Sometimes I cannot meditate at all. My mind is just all over the place. But I find that if I just pour out to that presence what's going on in me, after a while the mind begins to still. It's like talking to your best friend. And that's one experience of relationship. The other relationship is listening, because it is part of the Christian way that presence is seeking to guide us and speak to us. But listening is a great problem. And one way of listening is to go in one's imagination. Use a visualization and allow God to speak to you through that. I go and meet Jesus in my imagination frequently. It's a way that is from the Ination tradition. Ignatius founded the Jesuits. And things happen in that. This whatever is there is reaching back. So there is talking and there is listening, but the deepest way, the deepest expression of any relationship is that being with in communion. My wife and I have been together so long now that we can not speak to each other for hours. We can be together in the same room, yet it's the deepest relationship. We are just so at one with each other. And that, if you like, is the contemplative experience. And as in my relationship with my wife, it moves between them. Listening, I don't listen to my wife very often. Talking, I do a lot of that. But being with. And these are the ebbing and the flowing of the relationship. And in the Christian contemplative tradition, that is present. But what holds it all is the presence here now. And whatever is happening, one hopes, is happening within that.
When you talk about you and God, who is the I that you talk about as you?
Yeah. This is where it gets tricky. We're beginning to move into paradoxical areas. And paradox is a very important element in contemplation. This is where two ideas both seem true but don't fit together. And we've been conditioned to choose between one or the other. In contemplation we don't, because we actually think that those ideas are actually just pinpricks of light coming from a deeper truth. Okay. And eventually they do resolve. So who is it who's relating to God? sometimes it's little old Simon Small who's got himself in a stew about something. And that's very much an, you know, a me here and a him, her, it, there kind of relationship. But sometimes Simon Small is very present in the moment, full of the mystery of life and of the wonder of this. And then it's very difficult to say where whatever I am ends and whatever God is begins. It's the two have become very close indeed. And that's where the language breaks down.
And that's where the mystery truly starts.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have about, I'm looking at the clock, we have about 3 minutes left.
Right.
What would you say to somebody that's been touched by our conversation and something connects about your life and what you said? What would you say to them in those 3 minutes?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say, enter stillness. Try and taste the wonder of being. Go out in nature. Whatever it is that brings this sense of wonder into your life. And then, as you're experiencing that quality of consciousness, hold the question, where do I go from here? And my experience has been that as one holds the question within this deeper consciousness, that sooner or later, it may not be straight away, it may be in a conversation a few days later or something that happens in life, you begin to see the next step. Of course, there are people you can read. There's my book. There's a Franciscan friar called Richard Rohr, that's R-O-H-R, who is a great teacher of this, from within the Roman Catholic Church. And he has a wonderful way with language of explaining it. So there's people like me, people like Richard Rohr. But really, if you want to walk the contemplative way, it starts with trying to be within contemplative consciousness and then see where it takes you.
And life somehow takes you somewhere, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
You find there are deep currents. There is a hand on your elbow and you find yourself being led to things. But I wouldn't want anybody to believe this. This is something you can go and explore and verify for yourself. My experience has been that there is something extraordinary there.
That's a great note to end on.
Okay.
Something extraordinary there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, for coming along to talking
It's a
to
pleasure.
Conscious TV. I'm just going to mention Simon's books again, From the Bottom of the Pond, and we talked quite a lot about what's in this book. And his novel, Star Pilgrim, which we didn't touch on so much, but has some biographical elements of Simon's life. So, thanks again, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching Conscious TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.
Hello, my name's Simon Small. I'm a priest in the Church of England, but perhaps a rather unusual priest because my life is devoted to the contemplative way, or if you like, the mystical tradition of Christianity. And I've been asked just to share with you a simple meditative exercise that I find very powerful. I don't know about you, but most mornings when I wake up, my mind is all over the place. I'm convinced there's a problem, but I don't know what the problem is. And my mind goes everywhere trying to solve this problem it can't identify. And what I found is I just do this simple practice. And I found it very powerful in just bringing me back to the present moment, bringing me back to the sheer wonder and mystery of being alive. So what I do most mornings, just for about 5 minutes, is I just close my eyes and just begin to enter into the moment. And I may start by just paying attention to all the sounds that are around. Often in the morning it's the sound of a bird, or it might be cars going past. but I just pay each one a bit of attention, allowing it to be exactly as it is. Immediately I find my mind begins to still. And perhaps I begin to notice how each sound arises and ceases. It comes and it goes. Never to be the same again in that way. And often when I do this, I just begin to have a little taste of how mysterious and wondrous life is. And I take my attention from all my personal dramas, the great story that's running, and just pay attention to the moment. And then I'll begin to bring my attention into my body. I usually start with my feet and just begin to pay attention to all the very subtle sensations that are there that I don't normally notice. And then very gently I allow my awareness to rise through the body, slowly up through the legs, finding yet more sensations. As I sit here now, I'm aware of the chair supporting me. And then my awareness continues to rise up through the stomach. Often I have to relax my stomach muscles because they are tense. And then I pay attention to my chest and the gentle rhythm of breathing. And then up through the shoulders and the neck, into the face, where there are so many tense muscles. I let those relax as well. Perhaps I become aware of my breath as it enters and leaves the nose. Cool on the way in and warm on the way out. Until finally I'm back in that mysterious space behind my eyes, where a few minutes ago all those thoughts were whizzing around, all those worries. Except now it's a still place. And then I spend just a little while in that stillness. And it's very beautiful. And then finally, I begin to pay attention to that very, very subtle, delicate vibration in the body that we call life. We don't know what it is, but we have a word for it. But I pay attention to it. And I realize what an extraordinary thing it is. And what a miracle it is that I am here now. With with that feeling, I open my eyes and I'm a little more ready for the day that beckons. And that's a little exercise that one can do at any time. It can last 2 minutes or 10 minutes. But particularly at the beginning of the day, it can literally change your experience of the world. And so I offer this to you, and I hope it will be helpful.